Hi all. For those of you stuck at home looking for something to do, let me recommend to you The Count of Monte Cristo. It's one of my favorite novels. And here's a line at the end of the book. Until the day when God shall deign to reveal the future to man, all human wisdom is summed up in these two words: wait and hope. The providence of God is one of the themes in the book. Alexander Dumas acknowledges that God is in supreme control over human events. And he recognizes human responsibility. We are responsible to act rightly. The trouble is that he portrays God as being impersonal and somewhat unfeeling and uncaring. In contrast, consider the providence of God in the story of Joseph in Genesis 39 to 50. Just like Edmond Dantes, the hero of The Count of Monte Cristo, Joseph had been betrayed and imprisoned, but providentially freed. You probably know who Joseph is. He was the son of Rachel, the wife that Jacob really loved. So he was Jacob's favorite son. And the symbol of that unfair favoritism was the coat of many colors that Jacob had given to Joseph. Naturally, his brothers hated Joseph's guts. And Joseph did not help matters very much. He boasted about a dream that he had that his brothers would one day kneel before him. And he badmouthed his brothers to his father. Their hatred for him came to a head one day when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers. When they saw him from afar, they decided to kill him. But their oldest brother Reuben convinced them to throw him into a pit to starve him to death. Reuben wanted to rescue Joseph later on so that he could get into Jacob's good books. But Reuben left. So his brothers decided to sell Joseph into slavery. And to explain his disappearance, they tore up that coat of many colors and dipped it in blood to make it look as if he had been killed by wild animals. Joseph ended up in Egypt, a slave to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. Where was God in all this? Genesis 39:2 tells us, the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. God had kept Joseph's brothers from killing him and was blessing Joseph in Egypt. Unfortunately, Joseph's success would be his undoing. He became Potiphar's personal servant and household overseer. But that brought him to the notice of Potiphar's wife. She liked his good looks. And day after day, she tried to seduce him, but unsuccessfully. Finally, one day she caught him in the house alone and grabbed his outer garment. Joseph did the only thing he could do. He ran away as fast as he could because he knew to fool around with Potiphar's wife was to sin against God. So what did Potiphar's wife do? She cried rape. And in return for his loyalty to Potiphar and integrity of heart, Joseph landed in jail. Where was God when this miscarriage of justice was taking place? Genesis 39:21 tells us, the Lord was with Joseph. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Seems rather hard to believe, doesn't it? But that's certainly what Joseph himself believed. He did not become embittered. In fact, his conduct was so exemplary that the jailer put him in charge of Pharaoh's baker and cupbearer when they were imprisoned. And we see Joseph's faithfulness to God as he pointed the baker and cupbearer to God when they were troubled by their dreams. The cupbearer and baker told Joseph their dreams and he interpreted them. And as he foretold, the baker was executed on Pharaoh's birthday. The cupbearer was restored to his position. Knowing that the cupbearer would be restored to office, Joseph asked him to ask Pharaoh to release him. Joseph's attitude of actively trusting God in the midst of difficulties is very different from passive, fatalistic acceptance of life's curveballs. But sadly, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. But even then, God was still at work. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream that troubled him, and no one could interpret it. Finally, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And all of a sudden, Joseph was face to face with Pharaoh, interpreting his dreams and advising him how to prepare for the famine God was warning about in the dreams. That led Pharaoh to recognize that God was with him. So he made him second in command over the whole land. Joseph went from prisoner to prime minister. And in due time, the famine did take place. The famine was so bad, everyone was affected, just like our current crisis. But Egypt was more than ready for it. Joseph had done such a good job stockpiling food, there was enough not only for Egypt, but also for the rest of the known world at that time. So Joseph's brothers found themselves in Egypt needing to buy food. And they found themselves facing Joseph. But they didn't know that this was the very brother that they had sold into slavery. So they bowed before him to show respect, fulfilling God's promise to Joseph. And on their second trip to buy food, Joseph finally revealed his identity to them. And he insisted that the entire clan relocate to Egypt. You can imagine Jacob's amazement at finding out that his favorite son, whom he had feared dead, was alive and doing very well. 17 years later, Jacob died. And his brothers were afraid that Joseph would now take revenge. So they came to him for forgiveness and mercy. And we catch a glimpse of the depth of Joseph's faith in God. He told his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." Joseph rightly understood that though God did not approve of his brother's actions, God was still working out his good purposes. God was in control all along, even when Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, when he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and while he was forsaken by Pharaoh's cupbearer. In fact, we realize that there is more to the story than God keeping his promise to Joseph. We also see a partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and to Jacob that their descendants would be a blessing to the whole world. That promise would be ultimately fulfilled by Jesus Christ through his death and resurrection, because Jesus' death and resurrection saves us from our sin and condemnation. But to go back to the story, you also realize that the migration of Jacob's family to Egypt was God's way of protecting them and forming them into a distinct nation to fulfill his promise to Abraham that his descendants would live in a foreign land for 400 years. The bottom line is that we who have entrusted our lives to God have the assurance that God is with us regardless of the circumstances. And he is guiding our lives according to his wise purposes. So till tomorrow, let us comfort our hearts with the words of this song. God is too wise to be mistaken. God is too good to be unkind. So if you don't understand, when you don't see his plan, when you can't trace his hand, trust his heart.